Hello. Hello, Lawrence Park Church. So good to see you. Hello, everyone on Zoom. I don't know where to look, but hello. I'm really grateful to be here. The warm welcome this morning has been very lovely. So I just want to say thank you for that. I'm really excited to open up the Word today together. And what is interesting about what the lectionary brings us today is this character Nicodemus, which I'm excited to talk about. But before we talk about him, I need to tell you about two other people, Amy and Jeremy. Okay, so first off, Amy. Amy's a lawyer, incredibly intelligent and compassionate. She came to me years ago after asking to volunteer in the community in some way. Our first meeting was great. She told me all about the work she had done, both professional as well as volunteer. She was willing to help us in whatever way was needed. Then, towards the end of our conversation, she says to me, "Angie, can I ask you something? I thought that shelters were pretty rough, but one man told me that he loves it there. So then why are others choosing to be homeless? Why don't people that sleep outside just give shelters a try?" Let me first say, if internally you're kind of groaning or screaming, I am with you, and I was you. And yet, she was speaking from a place of such deep curiosity, and I did see that keen desire to understand and hear more stories and learn more. So we agreed that Amy would volunteer at the church. So next, let me tell you about Jeremy. He lived in shelters for many years after being kicked out of his home in his teens because of his sexual orientation. He came to the drop-in I worked at for food and support. Jeremy was easy to talk to and even easier to love. He was open about his trauma, his schizophrenia, and his goals for the future. He wanted to become either a chef or a teacher. He became a volunteer, and this is when him and Amy first crossed paths. Amy and Jeremy bonded right away. They cooked and laughed together every week. One day, I overheard the best conversation between the two of them. Jeremy said, "Amy, true or not true? Someone just yelled very loudly that they are stuck in a well." Amy laughed a little and said, "Nope, not true." Jeremy said, "Phew, okay, I was wondering, where is there a well in here anyways? Although church basements do never cease to surprise me." Amy laughed and offered to take him out for a walk and a coffee. How incredible was it that Jeremy trusted Amy to help decipher his hallucinations for him? That was mutual Christian love right there. One day, Jeremy had shared with us that he was getting housed. He was so excited. Amy and others in the kitchen baked him a cake to celebrate, and they pulled together supplies for his new place. Now fast forward to a morning about 2 months after he was housed. Jeremy didn't show up one day, which was highly unusual. And then later that day, I got a call from a police officer. The officer explained that Jeremy had broken every light on the outside of the house that he was living at now, and all of the lights at the neighbors' houses all down the street. And the neighbors were not happy, as you can imagine. The landlord was adamant that he would have to move. He was currently in jail for destruction of property. The officer said that Jeremy was very honest about it all. He had just kept hearing in his head that he had to break the lights. He knows now that that was a hallucination, but unfortunately, it was a little too late. I was so sad. I called Amy to tell her the news, and she was really sad too. How could this be, she just kept saying. The next morning, she called me. She told me that she thinks he can get really great mental health support while in jail. She said, "It's perfect, really. He can be in a safe place and get supports that he wouldn't otherwise get." Well, I don't know about you, but I thought, since when do we consider jail a safe place? I took a breath. I reminded her of Jeremy's trauma that he had experienced in shelters, but she was convinced that the guards are there to protect the people and to keep them safe. I explained that Jeremy was thriving because he was volunteering here in a church with loving people like her, and her response was, but I think he can volunteer in the kitchen there too. He'll love that. I explained that his lawyer will instead try to keep him out of jail with conditions, but she insisted that the support Jeremy might get there would be incredible and immediate and is probably the best place for him, she said with such confidence. You see, Amy deeply believed that the system was there to rehabilitate and support people, and that if the person was simply willing, the system would surely work for them. Her perspective didn't allow her to see the danger he could be in, the soul-crushing experience that jail has on the human psyche, the fact that almost everyone I know comes out of jail more unwell, more unstable, more entrenched in poverty. The same woman who I witnessed love this young man in the most beautiful way just didn't get this part. This experience with Amy came to mind this week as I was reading and learning about Nicodemus. He's a character that shows us some moments of great compassion and even bravery. But he also is a character that doesn't seem to be able to get out of his specific ways of thinking even until the end. So in the book of John, Nicodemus appears to us 3 times. Our reading today is his very first appearance. And today, to be honest, he's looking a little bit like a fool. I mean, he's asking perhaps the most embarrassing question in the Bible, but Jesus, how does someone be born again without coming out of their mom again? We gotta laugh at that, right? But what I think his words show us is a man who has witnessed the work of Jesus and is desperate to understand, kind of like Amy in that first conversation. Nicodemus has even snuck out at night to ask Jesus these things because he couldn't be caught talking to him in the light of day. Now, the second time we see Nicodemus is in John 7. When some of the chief priests and Pharisees asked the temple guards when some of the chief priests and Pharisees asked why the temple guards failed to bring Jesus to him, Nicodemus speaks in low-key defense of Jesus, suggesting that Jewish law requires that a person cannot be condemned without first being heard. Okay, now this is interesting. This tells us a few things. 1, Nicodemus is keeping up with Jesus. He's following him and he's paying attention. 2, Nicodemus is getting more brave. This time he spoke up in the light of day and in front of his fellow colleagues. This was indeed a risk. And 3, Nicodemus clearly thinks that Jesus has the right to a hearing. It seems that Nicodemus believes that if he has a hearing, Jesus will be saved from his impending fate. This reminds us that he is still a staunch believer in the system around him. He thinks that within the confines of that system that he so trusts and upholds, surely a just and fair verdict will come. And then the very last scene with Nicodemus is in John 19. After Jesus' crucifixion, he assists Joseph of Arimathea in lying Jesus' body in the tomb. He brings along a large amount of myrrh and oils to anoint him. Clearly, this man has been moved by Jesus to be here in the tomb alongside him. That is clear. And scholars point out that he was wealthy enough to purchase an exorbitant amount of oils, 75 pounds, in fact. So we could stop here and talk only about Nicodemus's transformation, and that would make a good sermon. But you know what? it's unfortunately more complicated than that for me this week. I do believe the story of Nicodemus is one of personal growth, but also it's a story of a character who falls short. Full and blinded trust of the system around him, even though he was sympathetic to Jesus, just doesn't seem to cut it. Both Amy and Nicodemus are curious and smart and compassionate. But there's another layer of transformation that is a really hard one to work through. And guess what? I think we are all there too. I think we, the church, are there together, in fact, right now. You see, the future of the church here in Toronto and across the country is going to look very different than it does right now. That Pew data collection study that was released a couple of years ago confirmed that the church in Canada is shrinking fast. At the top of those lists are Anglican and United churches, dwindling in numbers and fewer people engaged. The projection, according to the study, was that the church as we know it could be non-existent by the year 2040. So it's been interesting over the couple of years to observe the reactions of these studies. Some Christians take this all very, very personally. They may argue that with the nuances of the data, the way it was collected, or suggest partiality was at play. Others say it's the natural ebbs and flows, let's just stay that usual course. And then my friends on the outside of the church, well, they say, what are you talking about? What's a Pew study? And that, my friends, might be the most relevant observation of them all. Regardless, one cannot argue that the classic church of the past is dying and changing. This is a difficult process for folks. The pews where their family grew up, the organs that echo out of the doors on a Sunday morning, the stained glass windows that glimmer with color when the light shines just right, that's what going to church has looked like for a lot of people for a long time. But what about when we realize those pews are incredibly inaccessible? What about when an organ or window repair is more than a year's salary of a pastor, and the upkeep of an old church building completely distracts the community from genuine engagement outside of their walls? What about when we learn that people of different faiths and Indigenous people who have been deeply damaged by the church do not feel comfortable, for very valid reasons, walking into those old classic church buildings? What about when there's a housing crisis and people are sleeping on the cold street while some church buildings on those very same streets sit empty for 6 days of the week? But we, like Amy and Nicodemus, have a really hard time getting out of those church constructs we have worked so hard to create. A few weeks ago, a friend who was at Trinity Center's foundation told me about a church up north who decided to give their building away to the local Indigenous community. They remain on the governing board, but only have one voice out of 7 at that table. They are only very partial share owners, and mainly for the purposes of carrying the cost of insurance and working towards right relations with their local Indigenous community. They have, in every sense of the word, let go. I literally get the chills every time I think about this. Because what? They just gave it away? But what about the prestige and the power that comes along with being the sole owners of that property in their community? Don't they have so much to lose with this risk? Yes, I think they do. But even so, they felt very convicted to play their part in Indigenous reparations, and so they did. And not only will this make an impact on their own local community, but their actions stir and awaken my soul to new ideas and manifestations of renewal and transformation, and I bet it does for you too. And that, my friends, is the Holy Spirit at work. I chose last year to leave a position I loved for 10 years to join you in the United Church, to work in Regent Park as a community pastor because I yearn to experience a glimpse of what I think ministry in the future of the church is going to look like. I have traded a beautiful church building on a prominent downtown corner for a small office in a community center. We are essentially a church without walls, and I am often a pastor on the move, hanging out with folks both inside and usually outside of the building. I have less control of the space where I am now. I am, however, present in ways I did not have the capacity to be in years prior. I don't have a lot of people gathering in pews on Sundays to listen to me preach anymore, but I do, however, have a very eclectic and fun church community that meets on Fridays at noon in the drop-in, where we sing, pray, and learn, and some of the prayer requests, things like, I don't know where to sleep tonight, become very tangible conversations of community support, like, hey, after church, why don't you come to my office and we'll call and we'll try to get you a shelter bed. And sometimes I'm invited into spaces like yours as well, churches that are wishing deeply to learn and see and understand how the Spirit is moving in different parts of the city and how they can be part of it. I'll be honest, I do feel the tension of the things I traded most of the time. People knew my old place of work as a landmark, while almost no one has heard of Regent Park Community Ministry. But what I might have lost in some prestige, I traded for flexibility. I can visit folks in their TCHC units next door who are afraid to leave their apartments. I can bring food to those whose cupboards are completely bare. I regularly do outreach in the local park and help train neighbors and staff at the local library on compassionate de-escalation. I plan special events with neighbors in Regent Park involving bouncy castles and dunk tanks for kids living under the poverty line. I can show up at City Hall when people I care deeply for are being forgotten in policy. And by the way, I am often standing next to your pastor there too, who I'm always inspired by. Thank you, Stephen. Sometimes I pop into Tim Hortons and see who needs a listening ear. Some days are full of organizing, advocating, and speaking, while others are full of being present in whatever quirky and quiet ways that looks like. I am not, of course, suggesting that this is the only way that church will be done in the future. Some churches, perhaps like your own, might continue to function in similar ways as they do now, but work to deeply expand their partnerships and their collaborations. But my deep hope is that my experience of church now in Regent Park must be what we are working towards together as the church, especially in neighborhoods of high need. I hope this means we move swiftly in practical ways, using our land to create deeply affordable housing, community hubs, multi-faith and resource spaces. And sometimes I think it will mean we just simply need to take the risk and let go. I think Nicodemus's character can help us today with two things. First, he reminds us that we are all complex. People can be both transformed and also in need of continual transformation. We are all on that journey, and we need each other's patience and guidance to continue to make our way. And lastly, I believe that we see today that Nicodemus is yearning for full transformation, but just can't let himself fully embrace it, as he mostly lurks in the shadows, keeping hold of his wealth, unwilling to deviate from his constructs. Although he does act with compassion, he isn't yet willing to fully let go, to jump into the vulnerable spaces of the unknown, trusting the process of new life on the other end. My prayer for you, for me, and especially for the future of the church this morning, is that we can, in faith, take those leaps together. Thank you again so much for having me. Grace and peace.